an abandoned school, a forgotten piano, and a letter no one was ever meant to find. When Keanu Reeves opened that envelope, he uncovered a teacher's dying wish and a student lost in time. But what if the girl who once saved him didn't even remember his name? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun hung low over the hills of rural Montana, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement outside the abandoned school. Keanu Reeves stood quietly in front of the chain-link fence, hands in his pockets, scanning the worn facade of what used to be Ridge Valley Elementary. Paint peeled from the door frames, windows were dusty and cracked, and weeds grew tall through the playground asphalt. It was quiet here, almost too quiet. He hadn't meant to stop. It was a detour off a detour. A sign that read, "School for Sale" on the edge of town had caught his eye. Something about the phrase pulled at him, like a thread in the back of his mind he couldn't name. He parked his bike beside a faded blue dumpster and walked toward the side entrance. The door gave a reluctant creak as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memory. Broken chairs lay piled in corners, and children's artwork from decades ago curled and faded on bulletin boards. Every footstep echoed down the hallway like a voice that had waited too long to be heard. Room by room, he wandered. The gymnasium still held a faint smell of sweat and rubber. The library shelves stood empty, the spines long removed. But it was the music room, tucked at the far end of the east wing, that made him stop. The door was locked. Keanu paused, brushing dust from the small window. Inside, he could just barely make out a lone upright piano. It sat under the light of a cracked skylight, like a monument no one visited anymore. He looked around, spotted a janitor's key ring still hanging from an office door, and with a small breath of hesitation, tried one. The lock clicked open. The music room was preserved like a photograph. Faded posters of composers lined the walls, and sheet music sat curled on rusty stands. The piano was old, oak-bodied, its varnish dulled with age. One of the keys had a chipped corner. Keanu sat on the bench, running his fingers over the lid before slowly lifting it. No sound. Then he noticed something beneath the seat. He opened the bench and found layers of forgotten music sheets. And beneath them, a single yellowed envelope, brittle at the edges. It was addressed in careful looping handwriting. To the one who still remembers. He held it for a long moment, the weight of it heavier than paper. Then, with quiet reverence, he slid his thumb beneath the seal and opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, ink faded. At the top, one name was underlined. Howard Leland, music teacher, Ridge Valley Elementary. Keanu leaned back and began to read. To the one who still remembers. If you've found this, the world has likely moved on, but if you're reading, then maybe not everyone has. Keanu read slowly. The handwriting was precise but trembled in parts, as though written by someone whose hands had grown used to silence. The letter stretched several pages. He turned to the second, as a creak sounded faintly from the old rafters above. "My name is Howard Leland. I taught music here for 31 years. I wasn't famous, I wasn't brilliant, but I believed in something that budgets and politics eventually forgot. Music heals. It teaches kids to breathe through pain, to speak when words fail. And it gave me purpose, even when the district stopped paying me." Keanu blinked, staring at the sentence. He shifted slightly on the worn bench, letting the words settle. The stillness of the room felt sacred. They shut down the program in 2002. I kept showing up for another year. The doors were locked, but Jerome, the janitor, he left the back door open for me. I'd sit at the piano and wait. Sometimes a student would wander in. Just one. But that was enough. The next line had a name circled in pencil, as if it had been added later. Clara May. He read it twice. She was 12, small for her age, lived in foster care, didn't speak much, but when she played, the room disappeared. She didn't just read notes, she told stories. Each song sounded like it was made from the weight she carried, and she carried too much for someone her age. A lump formed in Keanu's throat. He pressed the edge of the envelope closed to stop his hands from shaking. One day, she didn't come back. A social worker told me she'd been transferred to another county. No forwarding info, just gone, like too many others. I kept coming for a while, hoping she'd return. She never did. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment. The room was still. Dust hung in sunbeams like silent applause for ghosts. They said music didn't matter anymore. They said the funding wasn't worth it. But they were wrong. Kids like Clara, she mattered. If anyone finds this, please tell her she was the reason I stayed. There was a final line, written shakily at the bottom. She was the song that kept me going. Keanu folded the letter gently, as if returning it to breath. He placed it back in the envelope, then set it beside him on the bench. He looked around the room, searching for any sign of this Clara May. A photo, a program, a list. Nothing. But someone remembered her. Mr. Leland had, and now, so did he. Keanu stood slowly, scanning the room again with new eyes. The chipped music stands, the faded posters of composers lining the walls, a dusty metronome frozen mid-swing on a shelf. Every detail told the same story. Someone had once believed this room mattered, and someone else had let it die. He ran his hand lightly over the top of the piano, feeling the etched initials of students long grown. Then he crouched to open the bench again, gently lifting each sheet of music. Most were torn, faded, or scribbled with pencil notations. Slow here. Breathe. Think of her. He stopped when he found a folder marked Recital, Spring '98. Inside was a worn program, a class photo tucked in the back. Dozens of children posed under a banner that read, "Music tells the truth." In the front row was a girl with dark eyes, staring straight at the camera with a seriousness too old for her face. Her name, handwritten below, Clara M. Keanu slipped the photo and the program into his jacket, then stepped back and looked once more at the room. The piano bench remained open, the envelope still resting on top. For a second, he thought of taking it with him, but no, he couldn't, not yet. Some stories needed to be carried with care, not just by hand, but by heart. He closed the lid on the bench slowly, deliberately, then reached for his phone and took a single photo of the room. The sunlight catching the dust, the piano angled just right. He sent it to a contact, just one word beneath it, remembered. As he exited the music room, the heavy door creaked shut behind him. The echo of it rang down the empty hallway like the final chord of a forgotten symphony. In the main hall, the lockers stood silent. Keanu paused near one with peeling stickers of musical notes. A memory, not his own, flickered, of a girl tapping rhythms on the metal with nervous fingers, waiting for her next lesson. He pushed open the front doors of the school and stepped back into the Montana sunlight. The mountains loomed in the distance, ancient and silent, the kind of silence that dared you to break it. He didn't know yet how or where, but he knew this. He would find Clara May. She had been forgotten by almost everyone, but not by him, and not anymore. The letter felt fragile in Keanu's hands, the kind of paper that seemed to hold more than just ink. It was folded with care, the edges browned with time. He sat on the cracked bench beside the upright piano, the silence of the abandoned school around him as loud as a concert hall before the first note. Then he unfolded the letter. "Dear one who still remembers," it began. "My name is Howard Leland. For 32 years I taught music in this room. Not in concert halls, not for fame or applause, but for children like Clara May. Children who walked in carrying silence and left humming something close to hope. I was here when they first wheeled in this upright. The kids nicknamed it Old Hummer because it buzzed on the low G. We didn't care. We played anyway. We always played. But near the end, the music stopped. At least officially. The budget cuts came swift and sharp. First went the supplies, then the part-time teachers, then the program itself. One day, the principal handed me a letter and said I'd been phased out. But I wasn't done. So I stayed. No pay, no roster. Just the room. And the ones who still showed up. Keanu kept reading, eyes darting over the careful script. Clara May came that last fall. She was small, quiet, and never met your eye. She didn't speak much, but her hands told stories. She didn't need sheet music. She played like she was remembering something no one else could hear, and every time she touched these keys, I remembered why I stayed. Jean was one of the many who passed through this room, but she was different. Not because she was the best, though she was good, but because she listened. She heard things most kids missed. She taught me more than I ever taught her. Keanu paused, the image of a quiet child at a broken piano forming in his mind. Foster care moved her again in spring. I came in one morning and her seat was empty. I never got to say goodbye. I don't know where she went. I don't even know if she remembers me. But if someone finds this, if this building isn't just dust and echoes by the time you're reading, I ask just one thing. Tell her. She was the song that kept me going. Keanu folded the letter slowly, his fingers tightening around it as if it might slip away. He leaned back against the piano, feeling its frame creak beneath him. Somewhere beyond the peeling walls and dusty windows, time had marched on. But here, in this music room, something had stayed behind. Waiting for someone who still remembered. Keanu sat for a long time after finishing the letter. His mind drifted between the words, their weight pressing gently on his chest, like the first few bars of a sad melody. The letter was more than a goodbye. It was a love song to a forgotten generation of kids, to a classroom that didn't make headlines, to the quiet persistence of one man who refused to stop believing in the power of music. He placed the letter back into the envelope and tucked it safely into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he turned his attention back to the room around him. Dust still clung to the broken strings and warped sheet music. A cracked chalkboard leaned in the corner, and on it, faint but visible under the grime, were the remnants of a message written in cursive. Practice doesn't make perfect. It makes possible. Keanu ran his fingers across the keys of the upright. Most of them didn't respond, but one note, an off-pitch middle C, rang out. The sound startled him, not because of its volume, but because it felt alive. He imagined Mr. Leland staying behind after the school closed, sweeping floors, wiping down the bench, hoping that one day someone would come back not to save him, but to remember. Maybe that's why the letter was hidden where it was. Not in a drawer, not in an office, but inside the bench, where music had always begun. And then there was Clara May. Keanu opened his phone and typed the name into a search bar. But nothing concrete came up. Too many Claras, too many Mays, too many years gone by. He needed more. He left the music room and walked slowly down the hallway, stopping at a faded wall mural painted by students. Music notes and instruments surrounded by stars and stick-figure kids holding hands. A small dedication at the bottom read, "To Mr. Leland, you showed us we mattered." Something about that hit hard. It wasn't just about Clara. It wasn't just about one student. Mr. Leland had been one of those people who planted seeds he would never live to see grow. Keanu turned back once more before exiting. The sun had shifted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. He took one final look at the piano, then whispered into the silence, "I remember." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of grass and old wood. Keanu stood in the gravel lot for a few seconds longer, then made his way back to his car. He had a name. He had a story. Now he needed a trail. Back in his car, Keanu pulled out a worn notebook he kept in the glove compartment. He flipped past pages from past journeys, scribbled thoughts, quotes, addresses, sketches of people he'd met. He found a blank page and wrote in bold letters across the top, Clara May, the song that stayed. Underneath, he copied Mr. Leyland's closing line word for word. Tell her, she was the song that kept me going. He tapped his pen against the steering wheel, thinking, Clara could be anyone now. She could have changed her name. She might not even play music anymore. But the way Mr. Leyland described her, that kind of connection didn't vanish. It lingered, like the final note of a song held too long in the air. Keanu drove to the nearest library in the next town over. He asked the librarian about archived school records. It was a long shot, but he was used to those. She pointed him toward the back, where microfilm reels and dusty binders waited quietly for someone curious enough to care. He found a yearbook, 1999, Lincoln County Elementary. There she was. A blurry class photo showed a thin girl with straight hair and solemn eyes. Beneath it, Clara M., 3rd grade. On the next page, a photo from a school recital. The caption read, Spring Music Showcase, Mr. Leyland's class. A grand piano stood in the center. A girl sat on the bench. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like Clara. Her hands hovered over the keys. Next to her, a tall man in a tie with soft eyes looked on, proud. Keanu carefully took a photo of the page with his phone. Now he had something real. As he returned the binder to the shelf, the librarian asked him if he'd found what he was looking for. Not yet, Keanu replied, smiling softly, but I found where it starts. Outside, the sky had turned a deep gold. The sun dipped low over the Montana hills, casting long shadows like stretched-out memories. Keanu got into his car and opened his map app. He typed in a new destination, Idaho. Somewhere out there, a woman named Clara May had no idea a letter written decades ago, hidden in the bench of a forgotten piano, was about to change her life. Keanu returned to the school the next morning, not as a wanderer this time, but with purpose. The sun rose behind him as he drove the quiet gravel road back to the gates of the abandoned public school, dust trailing behind the tires of his rental. He held the letter in his pocket, worn now at the fold, the ink beginning to fade just slightly from where his thumb had brushed over it again and again. He had made one call the night before, to a number listed on a faded contact sheet in the school's closed district directory. He wasn't sure it would go through, but when the line picked up, a voice answered. Rough, skeptical, but not unfriendly. Yeah, I remember Leyland. Now Keanu stood at the edge of the cracked front steps, waiting. A battered pickup truck pulled into the lot, headlights still on even in daylight. The door creaked open. Out stepped a man in his 70s, lean and slow-moving, his gray overalls stained with years of work. His name was Jerome. You the one who called about the letter? Jerome asked, his voice lined with age but firm. Keanu nodded. You knew Mr. Leyland? Jerome squinted at him. Knew him? He's the reason I stayed an extra 10 years in this place. Everyone else walked out when the school shut down. Leyland just kept showing up. They shook hands, quietly, without fanfare. Inside, the school smelled of age and cold air. Jerome pushed the rusted door open with effort. The hallway lights were gone, but morning sun poured in through broken blinds. He led Keanu down a familiar corridor, past rows of empty lockers and bulletin boards layered with yellowed flyers. The door to the music room stood open now. Keanu had left it that way. Sat in the back of that room most mornings, Jerome said, his eyes softening as he looked toward the rows of empty chairs. Didn't have to be there. Just didn't feel right, leaving it all behind. Keanu looked at him. "Why did you stay?" Jerome chuckled, but the sound was dry. "'Cause Leland did, and because those kids needed someone, even if it was just the janitor keeping the piano dusted." He moved across the room and opened an old storage cabinet behind the piano. From a plastic box, he pulled out a large folder, held together by string. "Photos," Jerome said. "Leland never took many, but I did. Said the moments would matter more later. Looks like he was right." Keanu took the folder. Inside were dozens of photos, some blurry, others perfectly framed. Students laughing in music class, recitals. One photo stopped him cold. A young girl, maybe 10, with her hand on a piano key. Her eyes were closed. The man beside her, gray-haired, mustached, smiled with a gentleness that said everything. "Mr. Leland." "And the girl?" "That's her," Jerome whispered. "Clara May." Keanu sat in the dusty chair by the window, holding the photo of Clara May in his lap like it was made of glass. Jerome stood nearby, arms crossed, gaze cast over the empty music room with a mix of memory and regret. "She was quiet," Jerome began, lowering himself slowly into a creaky chair beside Keanu. "Didn't talk much, but when she played, everyone listened. It was like the whole world stopped." Keanu didn't speak. He let the silence linger, the weight of Jerome's words echoing inside him. The photo trembled slightly in his hand. The girl's expression wasn't just concentration. It was emotion, raw and unfiltered. You could almost hear the notes just looking at her. "She didn't belong to nobody," Jerome added after a long pause. "Foster system moved her around like a file, but Leland, he saw her, treated her like she mattered. He used to say she was born with music in her bones." Keanu turned to Jerome. "Do you know what happened to her?" Jerome shook his head. "She was here for 2 years, then gone. One Monday morning, her name was off the attendance roll. Leland asked questions, got nowhere. Truth is, no one ever answered when it came to foster kids." He stood and returned to the box, rifling through more papers. From the bottom, he pulled out a folded program, creased down the center, the ink faded but legible. It was from a spring recital. Clara May was listed near the end. "Leland made that night happen even after the funding dried up," Jerome said. "Bought the sheet music with his own money, invited anyone who'd listen, said it might be the last concert this town ever saw." Keanu held the program. The title of Clara's piece was handwritten beneath her name, "A Lullaby for No One." "All right," she made it clear, and she had clout. He ended with a voice of wrath. "I sent it like she was saying goodbye." For a moment, neither man moved. The dust particles in the sunbeams seemed to slow mid-air, hanging in a hush that matched the music neither of them could hear anymore. Finally, Keanu asked softly, "Was there anyone else? Anyone who might remember where she went?" Jerome nodded slowly. "Mrs. Gable. She was the librarian, kept track of every child like they were her own, even when the county didn't care." Keanu stood. "Is she still around?" "Lives out on the edge of town," Jerome said, fishing a small notepad from his coat. "Still sharp as a tack. Tell her I sent you. And bring the photo." Keanu took the note, tucking it into his jacket. As he turned to leave, Jerome put a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever it is you're trying to do, Mr. I think Leland would like you." Keanu nodded, eyes clouded but resolute. "I'm not doing this for me," he said. "I'm doing it for the music that never stopped playing." Later that afternoon, Keanu drove slowly down a gravel road just outside the edge of town, following Jerome's directions. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains, casting golden beams across the brittle fields that stretched endlessly to either side. At the end of the road stood a modest house with peeling white paint, a wraparound porch, and wind chimes that tinkled faintly in the breeze. He parked, stepped out, and approached the door. The sound of a radio playing classical music drifted from a screened window. He knocked gently. After a moment, the door creaked open to reveal an elderly woman with gray curls pinned back neatly and glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She eyed him for a long second, then said with mild curiosity, "You're not from the county, are you?" "No, ma'am," Keanu said with a soft smile. "I'm here about someone you once knew, Clara May." Her face didn't change, but her hands lowered slightly, and her posture straightened. "Jerome sent you." He nodded. Mrs. Gable opened the door wider. "Then come in. I've been waiting for someone like you." Inside, the living room smelled of cedar and old books. Dozens of photo albums lined the walls, and a piano, clean but clearly untouched in years, sat in the corner. Keanu offered her the photograph. She took it gently, adjusted her glasses, and stared at the image of Mr. Leland and the young girl. "I remember that night," she murmured. She played like she had something to say, but no words to say it. "I think we all knew in our hearts that it might be the last time we'd see her." "She disappeared?" Keanu asked. Mrs. Gable nodded. "Child Protective Services moved her. No notice, not even a goodbye." Mr. Leland was heartbroken. He came to the library nearly every week after that, looking for any news. And when the school closed, he left me a file, just one, marked with her name. She stood and disappeared down the hall. Moments later, she returned carrying a slim binder wrapped in a piece of faded ribbon. "And asked me to hold on to this," she said. "Said if anyone ever came asking, I'd know what to do." Keanu opened it. Inside were photocopies of school records, a recital flyer, a page from a music composition notebook, Clara's handwriting, and a tiny photograph of her younger self holding a toy keyboard. At the very back was a letter from Mr. Leland to Clara, dated just before his death. "Dear Clara," it began, "if you ever read this, I want you to know you changed my life. Not just with music, but with hope." Keanu closed the folder slowly, heart heavy. "Do you know where she might be now?" he asked. Mrs. Gable nodded faintly. "Last I heard, she was living in Idaho, working as a nurse. She stopped answering letters a few years back. Maybe she thought it was better not to remember." Keanu rose from his seat, clutching the folder to his chest. "I need to find her," he said. Mrs. Gable didn't ask why. She just replied, "Then bring her home, even if it's just to the music." Keanu sat on the motel bed, the letter still folded beside him. The photos Jerome gave him were stacked on the nightstand, untouched since he got back. He reached for his laptop, opened the anonymous blog he had quietly used for years, a digital space where strangers spoke with raw honesty. He typed a new post. The prompt was simple, but the weight behind it was anything but. "Was there a teacher who changed your life forever?" He clicked publish and sat back, not expecting much right away, but within minutes the comments began to roll in. The first reply was short. "Yes. She taught me music when no one else cared if I spoke." Then another. "5th grade, Mr. Alvarez. I was angry all the time. He handed me a trumpet and said, 'Play how you feel.' I never forgot that." Keanu read silently, letting the words fill the space around him. There were thousands like these, unseen stories, hidden teachers. One woman wrote about her high school choir director who let her sleep in the practice room after she was kicked out of her house. Another man remembered a substitute teacher who noticed his bruises and called someone. Then came one that stopped Keanu cold. "Sometimes music is the only thing we have." He bookmarked it. He closed the laptop, but the voices stayed with him. The weight of Leland's letter pressed gently in his chest. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. This was about every forgotten classroom, every teacher who paid for their students' lunches out of pocket, every child who found refuge in a song. Keanu stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Montana plains stretched wide and silent, the sunset throwing long gold shadows over the empty town. He knew what he had to do next. The next morning, Keanu returned to the small diner across from his motel. It was quiet, the kind of place where the sugar jars were sticky and the coffee came in chipped mugs. He slid into a corner booth and pulled out his phone, refreshing the blog post. More replies. I was in foster care. My music teacher used to let me play piano after school, just to feel human. Mrs. O'Hara? She brought me new sheet music every week even though I didn't own a piano. She believed I would someday. One comment simply read, they saved me without ever knowing it. Keanu sipped his coffee slowly, letting the weight of it settle. He thought about Howard Leland, staying in that school without pay, waiting long after the world had moved on. Not for recognition, not for praise, but for kids like Clara. He scrolled through the replies and paused on one long comment, written in shaky lowercase letters. I used to have stage fright so bad I couldn't talk. My teacher made me stand beside her at the piano until I learned to breathe again. She died before I could thank her. But I play now, every day. Keanu's fingers lingered on the screen, then tapped bookmark. He glanced up. At the counter, a young waitress was humming an old country song, out of tune but full of soul. Behind her, a faded corkboard held photos of local kids, school portraits, concert tickets, a hand-drawn thank you card from Mrs. T's class. He smiled softly. Even in forgotten towns, the echoes of teachers remained. Keanu stood, left a generous tip, and walked back into the cold wind. He had one more name to find today. Clara May. Not just a name in a letter anymore. Back at his motel room, Keanu sat on the bed, scrolling through the latest comments again. He had posted the prompt less than 24 hours ago, but already it had struck a nerve. The thread had gone viral in its quiet way. No flashy headlines, just raw memory and gratitude. One reply had over 100 likes. She handed me a violin and told me I didn't have to be loud to be heard. I still have that violin, and every time I play I hear her voice telling me I matter. My teacher stayed after class once when I was crying and said, "You don't need to be fixed. You need to be listened to." I never forgot that. And then, tucked halfway down the page, one that stopped Keanu in his tracks. I never knew my music teacher's name. I just remember the way he looked at me when I played, as if I was worth something. I only played once. I never got the chance again. But sometimes, I still hear the notes in my sleep. Keanu leaned forward, heart pounding gently. He didn't know if it was Clara. The post was anonymous. But it felt like her. Or someone just like her. He sat quietly, then reached for his notebook and wrote a single line. We remember through music what the world forgets. Then he underlined the name, Clara May. He wasn't chasing a story anymore. He was chasing a memory. And memories, when carried by music, never really die. The next morning, Keanu drove along the back roads of Montana, a soft mist rising off the fields. The address Jerome had given him was scribbled on the corner of the letter. Mrs. Gable. Try the blue house past the grain silos. It took a while to find, but when he finally pulled up to the small cottage with peeling paint and wind chimes on the porch, he could already sense he was in the right place. He knocked gently. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 70s with a silver bun, sharp eyes, and a sweater that looked handmade. She eyed him cautiously. "I'm looking for someone who remembers Howard Leland," Keanu said softly. Her posture straightened. She didn't ask who he was or why he was asking. Instead, she stepped aside and said, "Come in." Inside, the living room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Stacks of newspapers and photo albums lined the shelves. On the wall above the couch hung a faded black and white photo of the old school, children pouring out its front doors. Mrs. Gable poured 2 cups of tea before sitting across from Keanu. "I thought no one would ever say that name again," she said quietly. "He stayed long after the district forgot him. I think he was the soul of that place." Keanu nodded. "I found a letter in the music room, addressed to the one who still remembers." Her hands trembled as she set the teacup down. "He used to say that, toward the end, that someone had to remember the music, even if they tore down the walls." They sat in silence for a while. Then she slowly rose and walked to a cabinet. From within, she pulled out a dust-covered shoebox tied with string. She placed it on the table between them. "I kept this after the closure. I wasn't supposed to, but I couldn't throw it away." Inside were concert flyers, torn sheet music, a program from the school's last spring recital, dated May 1996. And at the bottom, wrapped in wax paper like it was treasure, was a single photograph. In it, a thin, bearded man sat beside a girl at a piano. His hand rested lightly above hers. They were both looking at the keys. "That's him," she whispered. "And that's Clara May." Keanu studied the photo. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. Her posture was rigid, but her eyes, they were full of something rare. Concentration, fear, and deep inside, wonder. Mrs. Gable gently touched the edge of the picture. She played the Schumann piece that night. Everyone cried, even the principal. It was the last thing she ever played here. The next week, she was gone. Keanu looked up from the photo. "Do you know what happened to her?" Mrs. Gable sighed, her gaze drifting to the window. "Clara was in foster care. We all knew it. Mr. Leland never talked about her situation openly, but you could see it in the way he looked at her, like she was holding herself together with strings, and music was the only thing keeping her from breaking." She stood and crossed the room to a bookshelf, pulling down a battered manila folder with handwriting barely legible on the front. "May, Clara, confidential." "I kept this too," she said, handing it to Keanu. "Back then we weren't supposed to save files once a student left, especially if they were transferred across counties. But something told me not to throw it out." Keanu opened the folder carefully. Most of the papers were faded. A few were water damaged, but one record stood out. A handwritten transfer note that read, "Clara May, reassigned to foster placement in Idaho. County social worker, M. Johansson." No specific city, no street address, but it was enough. Enough to build a trail. Enough to believe she still existed out there somewhere. "She simply just vanished after that?" Keanu asked. Mrs. Gable nodded. "One day she was here practicing scales with Mr. Leland. The next, her desk was empty. Her music was still on the stand. I remember Howard walking in the next morning, seeing the empty bench. He sat down and didn't speak for the rest of the day." Her voice faltered. "I think a part of him never recovered. He kept teaching for another 2 years without pay, just to keep the music room open. But when the doors finally shut, he never came back." Keanu's voice was gentle. "And you haven't seen Clara since?" Mrs. Gable shook her head. "No one has. She wasn't the kind of girl who left trails. She didn't speak much. But when she played, it was like she was saying everything she couldn't say out loud." Keanu looked again at the photograph. Mr. Leland and Clara, frozen in a moment that no longer had a place in the world. But something about it pulsed with life. The music may have stopped, but its echo remained. In a photo, in a forgotten letter, in the memory of those who hadn't let go. "Can I take this?" he asked, motioning toward the file. Mrs. Gable hesitated, then smiled softly. "If it helps you find her, then it belongs with you now." Keanu tucked the photo and file into his satchel and stood to leave. Before he reached the door, Mrs. Gable called after him. "You know," she said, "Mr. Leland always believed music didn't just teach discipline or beauty. He used to say it was memory, that the melodies we carry are where our stories hide, even when our minds forget." Keanu turned back, his voice low. I think he was right. Outside, the Montana wind cut across the open lot beside the school. The afternoon sun stretched long across the gravel, casting shadows from rusted playground swings that hadn't moved in years. Keanu stood by his car, holding the photo in his hand, studying the faces once more. Clara looked no older than 10 in the image, hair falling into her face, fingers hovering above the keys, a look of absolute focus as Mr. Leland turned a page of sheet music beside her. There was something sacred in it, something unspoken. Keanu knew, without words, that the girl in that photo had once believed in something bigger than herself. And someone had believed in her, too. He opened the folder again and scanned for anything else. School transfer dates, agency names. There wasn't much. But the name M. Johansson appeared once more, next to a faded Idaho County stamp from 2003. Keanu took out his notebook and began piecing together a route, cross-referencing what he could from public databases on his phone. He marked down small towns, possible agency branches, names that might still be in use. It would be like chasing a song with no sheet music, relying only on instinct and fragments of sound. But that was enough. He started the engine, the soft rumble cutting into the silence. Before pulling out, he looked one last time at the school building, its broken windows, peeling paint, and crumbling stairs. And then he looked at the music room, still visible through a single open window. A gust of wind blew across the hood of his car, scattering a few dry leaves. Then it was quiet again. But the mission had begun. He would find Clara May, not just because Mr. Leland had asked someone to remember her, but because Keanu understood what it meant to be the note that gets lost in a forgotten song, and the one who makes sure the music plays again. Boise was colder than Keanu expected. The sun hung low behind clouds as he stepped out of his rental car and stared up at the modest brick building in front of him. A long-term care home tucked between a pharmacy and a shuttered video store. There was nothing special about the place at first glance, but somewhere inside was a woman who had unknowingly carried a piece of someone else's heart for decades. Her name was Clara May. He entered the facility quietly, slipping through the main doors with a clipboard in hand. It was a prop, nothing more. A way to blend in, to look like someone on official business. The front desk receptionist gave him a polite nod, too distracted by her computer to ask questions. That was fine by him. Through the open hallway, Keanu caught sight of her. Clara. She was kneeling beside an elderly man in a wheelchair, gently adjusting a blanket around his legs. Her movements were practiced and precise, but her face told another story. There was tiredness in her eyes, not just from the shift, from something deeper. A kind of sadness that settles in quietly over the years, like dust in forgotten corners. He didn't approach her, not yet. Instead, he slipped the envelope out of his coat pocket. Inside was the photo of her and Mr. Leland at the piano. He had made a copy of the original, just in case. With it, he placed a carefully printed copy of the letter. He had transcribed Mr. Leland's handwriting, keeping it faithful. No signature, just the words, "To the one who still remembers." He placed the envelope at the front desk and walked out before anyone noticed. Inside the care home, it sat there for hours before someone picked it up and placed it into the inter-office mail bin for staff. Clara found it at the end of her shift, just after clocking out. At first, she thought it was a misdelivery. She never received personal mail at work, but her name was written clearly on the front. She opened it slowly, still standing by the lockers. The photograph came first. Her breath hitched. That piano, that man, that moment. The recital. She could almost hear it again. She turned the photo over in her hand and then unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the first few lines. And then, stopping, the name, his name. She sank onto the nearby bench and read every word like it was a hymn. She had forgotten his name, but not his voice. Not the way he told her at just 9 years old that her hands were born for more than silence. Clara folded the letter back into its envelope with trembling hands. Her shift badge still hung from her neck, swaying slightly as she stood in the hallway, alone and unsteady. The letter had struck something she didn't even realize was still alive inside her. A flood of feelings surged to the surface. Confusion, awe, grief. She couldn't place why, but her throat tightened, and she felt like the air around her had shifted. The hallway lights suddenly felt too bright, the silence too loud. She slipped into the break room and sat at a corner table, away from the vending machine's hum. No one else was there. She laid the photo out again and stared at it. It wasn't just any memory. It was the memory. The one she hadn't thought about in so long, but that now returned with vivid, aching clarity. She could still feel the keys beneath her fingers, could still hear Mr. Leland's voice in her ear. Don't think, just feel. At 9 years old, no one had ever said something like that to her. Most adults talked at her, gave her instructions, commands, warnings, but not him. Mr. Leland had looked into her with something like reverence. He made her believe she wasn't just a placement on someone's clipboard or a number in a file. He'd made her feel real. And then, the system moved her again. Just like that. New county, new name, new caseworker. The piano was gone. The music stopped. She had told herself that was life, that it was just something kids like her had to get used to. But now, here it was again. A voice from the past, calling her by name, telling her she had been remembered all along. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, quietly, like rain hitting the break room floor. She pulled out her phone. For a long moment, she just stared at the screen, unsure what to do. Then, she opened her search browser and typed in a name she hadn't thought to look for in over 2 decades. Howard Leland. There was no obituary, no articles, just a listing buried deep in an alumni page from the 1970s. She felt the hollow in her chest grow deeper. Whoever had delivered this letter, they had done something she couldn't have imagined. They remembered him. Maybe they had even known him. Maybe they'd been one of his students. Or maybe they had found something. Something she was never meant to lose. Clara clutched the photo again and whispered, "Why now?" Outside, across the street in a parked car, Keanu sat watching the glow of the break room window. He didn't need to see her face. He just watched her silhouette, still and stunned, holding onto the paper like it was gold. He whispered back, because someone finally heard the song again. The next morning, Clara didn't speak of the letter, not to her colleagues, not to her patients, but everything about her shifted. She lingered longer at her elderly patients' bedsides. She asked about their favorite songs. One woman spoke of Glenn Miller. Another mentioned Chopin. Clara smiled softly and nodded each time, like she was tucking those answers somewhere inside her, piece by piece. Note. At lunch, she returned to the photo. She noticed something she hadn't before. Mr. Leland's hand resting protectively on her shoulder. It wasn't just a recital shot. It was a moment of grace. A frozen second where a child, usually invisible, was fully seen. And then she saw something else. Something faint in the background. Behind them on the chalkboard, almost erased by time, was a phrase written in chalk. She squinted to read it. "Music is the memory that outlives the silence." Clara gasped. That was his saying. He'd written it above the piano every morning before class began. She stared at it, stunned. The chalk might have faded, but the truth hadn't. That afternoon, she went home and pulled her old keyboard from the closet. It was dusty and 2 keys didn't work, but she plugged it in anyway. Rosie, her 7-year-old neighbor, peeked in curiously from the front door. Clara hesitated, fingers hovering. Then she played. The first few notes were hesitant, searching, but slowly something came alive. A melody she thought she'd forgotten began to emerge. It was clumsy, shaky, but it was hers. And buried in the cracks of the music was a warmth she hadn't felt in decades. Rosie clapped. "I didn't know you could do that." Clara turned to her and smiled. "I didn't either. Not anymore." That night, she sat in bed with the letter and the photo in her lap. She couldn't sleep. Her fingers twitched with a need she hadn't remembered having. She found herself humming the recital piece, almost as if it had waited all these years to be heard again. Across town, Keanu sat in his car, journal on his lap. He wrote one line. He still remembers. Even if she didn't know it yet. He closed the notebook and smiled to himself. The letter had made its way home. But the real music, that was just beginning. Keanu sat alone in his motel room, the lamp casting a low amber light across the pages of his notebook. His hands hovered above the keys of his laptop. He didn't know why this one was harder to write than the last. Maybe because this time, the story didn't belong to him. He could still see Clara's silhouette in the break room window, her head bowed, her hands clutching the letter like it might vanish if she let go. That moment had been seared into his mind, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet, still. Moments like that didn't demand attention. They deserved it. He opened the same online forum where he had posted weeks earlier about teachers who change lives. This time, he typed just 12 words. If you could thank someone who's no longer here, what would you say? He clicked post and leaned back. The screen went still for a while, just a blank field under his prompt. Then, one reply appeared. I'd say, you played the notes that saved me. He stared at the words. So simple, so haunting. Another came in. You made me feel seen when I felt invisible. Thank you. Then a third. And still playing, still remembering, you gave me the reason. Keanu scrolled, reading each one like he was flipping through someone's private journal. Dozens turned to hundreds. Names faded behind anonymous usernames, but their gratitude rang with a kind of harmony that no composer could write. One reply stopped him. It had no photo, no name, just 5 quiet words. Remembered me. After all this time, Keanu's breath caught. He reread it, then again. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. He knew it was her. He didn't reply. He didn't like it. He just stared at the sentence like it was a chord struck on a long-forgotten piano. It said more in its silence than any long paragraph could. He leaned forward and added it to his notebook in pen, slowly, carefully. He'll remember me. After all this time. Across town, Clara sat at her small kitchen table, an untouched cup of tea cooling beside her. The letter lay nearby, folded neatly. She didn't need to reread it again. She knew every word by now. She had typed her reply before she could overthink it. The words had just surfaced, and once they were posted, she felt strangely lighter, as if something she'd carried for decades had finally been named and released into the world. She didn't expect anyone to notice it. It wasn't for them. It was for him, not just Mr. Leland, but also, somehow, whoever had delivered that letter, whoever had known it still mattered. That, she still mattered. She wasn't used to being remembered. Foster care had a way of making children disappear in plain sight. Names changed. Homes changed. Even birthdays sometimes changed. But what never changed, until now, was the silence that followed when a child was moved. No one came looking, no one asked questions. Until now. She refreshed the thread, watching strangers pour their hearts out into the comment box. Some posts made her smile. Others made her quietly ache. I'd thank my grandfather for teaching me to whistle. It got me through the worst parts of deployment. My high school drama teacher once told me I didn't need to be perfect to be powerful. I've kept that with me through every rejection since. My big brother taught me to play the drums before he passed. I still play in his garage. I think he'd like that. There was something almost holy about it all, a collective cathedral of memory, where grief and gratitude shared the same pew. Clara reached for her tea, now lukewarm, and took a sip. She felt a weight shift inside her, a loosening of something knotted. Then a name surfaced in her mind. She whispered it aloud. Howard. It felt like music to say it, like pulling an old dusty book off the shelf and realizing the story had always been yours. She stood and walked to the corner where the old keyboard was plugged in. The afternoon light spilled through the window, casting pale gold streaks across the room. She placed her fingers on the keys again. This time, the melody came easier. She didn't try to play the whole song, just the part she remembered from that last recital, the part Mr. Leland had gently guided her through when her nerves nearly got the best of her. 3 notes in, she could hear his voice again. Don't think, just feel. Tears fell again, but they weren't the same kind. These ones didn't sting. They healed. Later that evening, Keanu sat beneath the motel's buzzing porch light, journal open on his lap. He watched the night settle around him like a wool blanket, quiet, heavy, full of unsaid things. He wasn't sure what came next. He had started this journey thinking it was about honoring a forgotten teacher. But now, he realized it was something larger. It wasn't just about remembering the past. It was about reviving it, about picking up a thread someone else had dropped and tying it to a new one so the music didn't end, just changed hands. He flipped to a fresh page in his notebook and wrote at the top, "Legacy lives in those who listen." And then, beneath it, he copied one more anonymous comment that had stayed with him since that morning. "You taught me how to listen for what's not being said." He closed the book softly, like closing a music box lid. The notes still lingered. Inside, his laptop pinged. Another comment had arrived. "Sometimes we don't need to be found, just remembered." Keanu didn't know who would read this thread tomorrow. Maybe no one, maybe thousands. But he knew someone out there was humming a melody they hadn't played in years. Someone was dusting off a memory. Someone was starting again. And maybe that was enough. The school was colder than Clara remembered. Or maybe it just felt that way because of the silence. No children's voices echoed down the halls, no clatter of instruments or shouts from the playground. Just the creak of the front door and the hollow sound of her own footsteps. She hesitated at the threshold, one hand resting on the frame. The building still looked the same cracked tiles, same faded wall paint, but something in her stomach twisted as she stepped inside. She wasn't sure if it was dread or longing. Keanu was already there, waiting. He stood near the old music room, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn brown jacket. When he saw her, he gave a small nod. No smile, no grand welcome, just recognition. Like he knew how hard it had been for her to come. She walked slowly toward him, her shoes making soft taps on the floor. The closer she got, the more memories rose up like dust motes in sunlight. The hallway, the classroom door, the faint scent of chalk and wood polish that never quite left. Keanu pushed open the door to the music room. The air inside was different, not just from time, but from care. Someone had cleaned. Recently. The boards were swept, the shelves were cleared, and in the center of it all stood the piano. Not just any piano. Her breath caught. It was polished. The keys gleamed. The cracks in the wood had been filled, the legs restored. A fresh coat of stain brought back the grain of the oak. Even the old brass pedals had been scrubbed to a quiet shine. It looked alive again. Clara stepped forward, one hand reaching toward the bench. She didn't speak. Neither did Keanu. Instead, he walked to a small table near the back wall. On it sat the envelope, the one with the photo and the letter, the one he had left at her care home. He picked it up and held it out to her. She took it without a word, her fingers trembling. Then she sat on the bench. Her hand hovered above the keys, but she didn't press them. Not yet. Clara let her hand rest on her lap, fingers curled loosely. The letter sat on the bench beside her. She glanced around the room, taking it in. Every corner, every shadow, every detail that time hadn't erased. The chalkboard was still there, and though it had been wiped clean long ago, she could still see the ghost of the phrase that had once been written there, bold and certain. Music is the memory that outlives the silence. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she let herself go back to being 9, to sitting on this very bench with her legs barely reaching the floor, to Mr. Leland, adjusting her posture gently, guiding her fingers to the right keys, telling her it was okay to feel everything, telling her it was okay to be everything. She opened her eyes and looked over at Keanu. He hadn't moved. He simply stood there, his presence steady but unobtrusive. "How did you—" Her voice trailed off. He looked at the piano, then back at her. "There's a man in town who restores instruments. Told me it hadn't been played in years, but the frame was still strong. Said it deserved another life." Clara nodded slowly. She reached out and touched the keys, not to play, but just to feel them. The ivory was cool beneath her fingertips, smooth, familiar. A tear slipped down her cheek. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Keanu didn't respond. He didn't need to. She looked back at the bench. There was a small plaque now, discreet but elegant, just above the keys. "In memory of Howard Leland, for the students, who played when no one else listened." Clara read it 3 times before the words fully sank in. Each time felt heavier than the last. She touched the wood just beneath the plaque. Then, very softly, she said, "Thank you." Not to Keanu. To Mrs. Leland. They didn't stay long. Clara stood after a few more minutes, folding the letter carefully and sliding it back into the envelope. She held it with the kind of reverence one might give a fragile artifact, as if it might dissolve if handled too roughly. Keanu walked her to the door, still saying little. The way he did things, quietly, respectfully, reminded her of Mr. Leland. Never seeking credit, just giving what he could, where he could. As they stepped into the hallway, Clara paused. Her eyes swept the space again. Then she looked at him. "Where did you do all this?" Keanu looked down for a moment, then shrugged slightly. "Because someone kept a promise, and I thought it deserved to be remembered." She studied his face, searching for something, a motive, an answer. But what she found instead was something better. He walked toward a kind of knowing that didn't need words. Clara nodded, then turned toward the door. At the threshold, she looked back once more. The music room stood behind her, bathed in soft light from the windows. The piano sat waiting. Not demanding, just there. She raised her hand slightly, not in farewell, but in thanks. Then she left. Outside, the air felt lighter. The sky had opened just enough to let a sliver of sun break through the clouds. Clara tilted her head and let it warm her face. She didn't know what she was supposed to do next. But something had changed. Later that night, in her living room, she opened the envelope again. She reread the letter, slower this time. She traced the edge of the photo, and then, without quite meaning to, she stood and walked to the corner. The keyboard waited. She sat. She placed her hands on the keys. But this time, she didn't play. She just let them rest there, like a promise. A beginning. Clara stood in the middle of her living room, arms folded, eyes locked on the dusty keyboard in the corner. It had been there for years, mostly untouched, moved from apartment to apartment like a forgotten piece of furniture that no longer served a purpose. But now, it felt like it was calling to her. She moved slowly, each step unsure. Her hands brushed the edge of the keyboard stand. She wiped a layer of dust from the keys with her sleeve. 2 of them were chipped. One of the black keys had a crack running down its side, but somehow it looked sturdier than she remembered. Not physically, emotionally. She pulled out one of the wooden kitchen chairs and placed it in front of the keyboard. She didn't have a real piano bench anymore. It didn't matter. The chair creaked softly beneath her as she sat down, suddenly aware of her heartbeat thudding in her chest. She stared at the keys. Her hands hovered over them but didn't land. Her fingertips trembled slightly, suspended in the air like the first drop of rain before a storm. She let out a shaky breath, then another. A memory came back to her. She was 9 years old again, sitting on a sturdy bench in a drafty classroom. Her feet didn't reach the floor. Mr. Leyland sat beside her, calm, gentle, always aware of when to speak and when to stay silent. She remembered the warmth of his presence, the way he said things like, "Don't fight the song, just follow it." She placed her fingers on the keys. The sound that came out was uneven. Not wrong, just out of practice. The first few notes stumbled forward like a child learning to walk. Her hands weren't sure of the spacing. Her rhythm was off. But she didn't stop. She kept going. The piece was one she had learned for her last recital. A short melody, bare, vulnerable, full of tiny pauses that made it feel more like a conversation than a performance. She hadn't played it since the day the system moved her to another home without warning. That had been the last time she saw Mr. Leland. The last time she believed she'd ever be anything more than a forgotten foster file. Now, here it was again. She fumbled one of the transitions. Her fingers landed on the wrong note. She stopped, sighed, and tried again. This time, she let the mistake happen and moved past it. Her hands remembered what her mind had buried. The shape of the song began to emerge, like a familiar path uncovered beneath years of fallen leaves. Her breath caught in her throat as the melody finally rose into something whole. Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't brush them away. They fell quietly down her cheeks and onto her wrists. But still she played. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Clara didn't notice she had company until she felt a presence in the doorway. She paused mid-phrase, fingers still resting gently on the keys, as her 9-year-old daughter Maya stood there silently in her unicorn pajamas, holding a half-eaten banana in one hand. "You were playing," Maya said, almost like a question. Clara turned slowly, surprised but not startled. "I was. I didn't know you could." Clara gave a small smile. "Neither did I, not anymore." Maya stepped into the room, careful, like she was entering a church. It sounded kind of sad, but nice, too. Clara looked back at the keyboard. "It's a song I used to play when I was about your age." "Did you make it up?" "No. A teacher taught it to me, a long time ago." Maya sat cross-legged on the carpet, chewing her banana thoughtfully. She watched her mother with the curiosity only children possess, the kind that doesn't press with judgment, only wonder. Clara wasn't sure how to explain everything, so she didn't. She just reached out and touched the keys again. She played a softer version of the melody, slower now, letting each note hang in the air for a moment before moving on. The mistakes were still there. Her fingers hesitated on the second run of the chorus. She missed a sharp in the final bar, but the music didn't feel broken. If anything, the rough edges made it more honest. Tears came again, but they weren't heavy this time. They flowed with the notes, not against them. When she finished, the room felt quiet, but full. Maya didn't say anything at first. She simply picked up her stuffed rabbit and placed it on the edge of the keyboard, as if the toy needed to witness what had just happened. Then, in the kind of voice a child uses when offering something sacred, Maya asked, "Can you teach me?" Clara blinked. "What?" "I want to play." "Like that." Clara stared at her for a moment. No one had ever asked her that before. She had played in rooms full of strangers, in foster homes at one recital, once, where applause had echoed but left her empty. This was different. This was her daughter, asking not for entertainment, but for connection. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "but we have to go slow. Your fingers are still small." Maya grinned and moved to sit beside her. "I like going slow." Clara adjusted the seat, helping her daughter settle in. She placed Maya's fingers over the first few notes. The keys looked even bigger beneath such tiny hands. Clara reached over and guided her gently. Start here. C, then D, then E. Maya pressed down, one at a time. The notes came out unevenly, almost like raindrops. Clara smiled. Perfect. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, their fingers taking turns, their laughter rising in between wrong notes and missed timing. Maya didn't care when she hit the wrong key. She simply tried again, undeterred, her little brow furrowed with concentration. Clara watched her daughter's hands and saw something she hadn't expected. Now, not just for Maya, but for herself. She had believed for years that her music had been locked in the past, tied forever to the loss of Mr. Leland and the childhood she never got to finish. But it was still here. Not perfect, not polished, but alive. And now it was being passed forward. When Maya finally leaned back and stretched her arms overhead with a satisfied groan, Clara took the moment to play again. This time, she didn't overthink it. She let her fingers lead. The melody returned, steadier now, familiar. She played the whole song from memory, even the final notes. She'd forgotten the first time. Maya watched quietly. When Clara finished, she looked over. Maya's voice was small. "Can I learn that one someday?" Clara nodded. "You will, when you're ready." They sat in silence for a long time after that. Not awkward silence, just peace. Later that night, Clara wrote the song's name in her journal. The Echo Song. She underlined it once and closed the book. The next morning, the keyboard was still open. Maya came running into the room before breakfast, set her stuffed rabbit on the bench again, and asked, "Can we practice now?" Clara looked at the keys, then at her daughter, and smiled. "Let's do it together." Clara couldn't sleep. The melody had been swirling in her mind for days now, unfinished but persistent. It came to her in fragments, sometimes in the shower, sometimes while washing dishes, often when Maya was asleep and the house finally settled into stillness. She would hum pieces of it without realizing, then scramble for her phone to record a rough voice memo before it slipped away again. One night, just past midnight, she gave up trying to rest and padded into the living room. The street outside was quiet. Moonlight spilled across the keyboard where it waited, familiar and patient. She sat down and stared at the keys for a long time. This wasn't the recital piece. It wasn't the Echo Song either. This was something new, something hers. She played a few slow chords, building from a simple root. The progression was soft, melancholic, but warm. It carried a feeling she couldn't describe. Grief, yes, but gratitude too. Not for what had been lost, for what had been given. It came together over the course of 2 nights. Short, uncomplicated, no big swells or climactic endings. Just a quiet, steady rhythm and a melody that circled back on itself like a memory. She wrote it down in pencil on the back of an old grocery list. 3 pages, carefully sketched out. At the top, she wrote the title, Still Here. When it felt complete, she asked Maya to help set up her phone. They placed it on a stack of books near the windowsill. Clara sat at the keyboard, took a deep breath, and nodded for Maya to press record. She didn't speak during the video. She didn't introduce the piece or explain why she wrote it. She simply played. The notes filled the small apartment, even as they stayed soft and slow. There was no flourish, no pretense, just her, the keys, and the silence between the chords. When she finished, she looked into the camera and spoke quietly. "I don't know if he can hear this," she said, "but I hope he knows he saved me." She reached forward, tapped the stop button, and sat back. The room was quiet again. Maya climbed onto the couch and laid her head in her mother's lap. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The next morning, Clara uploaded the video to a private cloud folder and composed a short email. There wasn't much to say. She typed, erased, and retyped the opening line 3 times before settling on something simple. "This is for him. Thank you for finding me." She attached the video and clicked send. Keanu received the email just as he was finishing a quiet walk through a park near the edge of town. He returned to his rental car, opened the door, and sat for a long moment before pulling out his phone. The subject line read, "Still here." He didn't recognize the name on the email address at first, but the file caught his attention. He played it through his phone's speaker, letting the soft piano fill the small space around him. The song began with a gentle opening. Each note was deliberate, steady. As the melody unfolded, it felt like a memory made audible, wounded but whole. It didn't demand anything. It simply arrived and stayed, like someone who came back after a long absence without needing to explain why. Halfway through, Keanu leaned back in the seat and closed his eyes. When the last note faded, he stayed still for a long time. Then he replayed it. The second time, he noticed the pauses, the restraint, the aching warmth woven into the simplicity. This wasn't music made to impress. It was music that had something to say. After the final note ended again, the video lingered, then Clara's face appeared, just for a moment. "I don't know if he can hear this," she said, "but I hope he knows he saved me." Keanu stared at the screen. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just breathed it in. Let it settle. He opened his notebook and jotted down 3 words. She played through. Then he wrote a second line beneath it. "The ones who matter never really leave." He didn't write back. He knew she didn't need a reply. Clara didn't expect a response. She hadn't sent the video for praise or feedback. She had sent it to release something that had been locked inside her for too long. Still, the days that followed felt different. She walked to work lighter. She spoke more gently to her patients. And each evening, after Maya went to bed, she would sit at the keyboard again and play, not to practice, but to remember. Sometimes it was "still here." Other times it was a new phrase, something she hadn't played before. But all of it came from the same place now. One night, Maya came into the living room while Clara was at the keys and placed a sheet of paper beside her. It was a drawing of a woman at a piano, her daughter sitting beside her with a stuffed rabbit in her lap. At the top, Maya had written, "Mommy's song makes the house happy?" Clara stared at it, unable to speak. She folded the drawing and tucked it inside her journal, next to the handwritten sheet music for "Still Here." The two belonged together now, one born from memory, the other from a new beginning. A week after she sent the video, Clara received a small package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single item, a flash drive. No note, no label. She plugged it into her laptop, unsure what to expect. There was one file, a video. She clicked play. It was a recording of the restored piano inside the old school's music room. The camera was still. No one appeared on screen. The room was empty except for the light from the windows and the sound of a slow wind outside. Then, from off-camera, a single note played, followed by another and another. It was the opening line of "Still Here." Clara watched, motionless, as someone, silent and unseen, played her song in the place where she had first learned to believe in music. It wasn't perfect. A few notes slipped slightly, slower than her version, but it was careful, respectful. She covered her mouth with her hand. At the end of the video, there were no words, just the camera lingering on the empty bench. "Still here." She let the screen go black, sat in silence, and felt the song settle again in her chest. Mr. Leland had never heard this song, but somehow, in all the ways that mattered, it had reached him anyway. The next evening, Keanu sat alone on the edge of his motel bed, a cup of black coffee cooling on the windowsill beside him. The video Clara had sent still lingered in his mind, the quiet dignity of her playing, the stillness in her voice, and that final sentence that carried more weight than any applause ever could. He opened his laptop and navigated to the same quiet online forum he had used before. No headlights, no likes, just words. A place where the noise of the world gave way to memory. He created a new post with a single question. What did someone give you that changed you forever? He hit publish, closed the lid, and let the silence take over. It didn't stay silent for long. Within an hour, replies began trickling in. Simple, honest, some joyful, some painful. All of them true. One of the first said, "My dad's war medal. He passed it to me after his last surgery. I still keep it in a frame on my desk." Another came from a teacher. Seemed to miss something. A student once gave me a folded note that just said, "Thanks for not giving up on me. I've kept it in my wallet for 13 years. Bet another, "My foster mom gave me her last name. That changed everything." Keanu read through them, slowly, one by one, each response unfolding like a page from someone's private story. He could feel the ache between the sentences, the weight behind the words. People didn't just answer with things. They answered with turning points. He bookmarked a reply from someone named Tessa. "I had a friend in high school who gave me rides home every day after my mom left. He never said anything, just waited outside the school. It taught me that some people show up even when they don't have to." Keanu nodded softly. That kind of giving stayed with you. More replies flowed in by morning. Keanu sat at a small table by the motel lobby's coffee machine, scrolling slowly through the thread as the world outside stirred awake. Someone had written, "As I was failing everything, and my music teacher gave me a practice room key and told me, 'This is yours whenever you need it.' I ended up staying in school just so I could keep using that piano." Another wrote, "My grandmother gave me a recipe card in her handwriting. She passed the next week. I never cooked before that. Now I run a bakery." Each message carried a piece of someone's soul, and Keanu took his time with each one. These weren't casual comments. They were confessions, little monuments to kindness. A new reply caught his eye. Short, unadorned, a piano, and a reason to play. He paused. No username, no photo, just that one sentence. He read it again, then once more. He knew it had to be Clara. No one else would have said it quite like that. He didn't respond. He simply bookmarked the comment and let the words sit with him. And a reason to play. He turned the phrase over in his mind as he walked back to his room. It echoed as he poured himself another coffee, as he opened his notebook and sat down to write. The simplicity of it struck him more than any long story. Sometimes, that's all a life needed, to pivot. Not a miracle. Shaftarism. He began jotting down other fragments from the thread, capturing the ones that stood out. "My brother's worn-out comic books. He used to read them to me when I was scared. My coach gave me a second chance when I messed up everything. That was all I needed. My 6th grade teacher told me my stutter didn't mean I was broken. It meant I had to be braver." Keanu filled 3 pages before closing the notebook. Outside, it had started to rain. Inside, the words lingered like a soft rhythm under everything else. That afternoon, Keanu returned to the school one more time. The front door creaked open with the same old groan, but the inside felt different now, less forgotten, less broken. He walked the halls slowly, letting the quiet settle. When he reached the music room, he paused, just outside, listening. There was no sound, but it didn't feel empty. The piano stood where it had before. The plaque beneath the keys still gleamed softly in the light from the high windows. Everything was still. Still here. He sat at the bench, not to play, just to sit. He pulled out his notebook and reread Clara's comment one more time. A piano. And a reason to play. He smiled faintly, then flipped to a fresh page and began to write again. Legacy was often quiet. Sometimes it's not a stage or a spotlight. Sometimes it's a hallway bench, a folded note, a single key pressed with hope. He stopped and looked around the room. He could almost imagine Mr. Leland still there, standing near the blackboard, arms crossed, watching over a group of scattered students, maybe even humming along with someone's hesitant melody. Keanu tore out the page and folded it. He walked over to the side of the room where an old shelf still stood, half covered in dust. He placed the note between the pages of a leftover songbook and slid the book back onto the shelf. It wasn't much, but it felt right. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed once in his pocket. He pulled it out. A new reply had just come in on the thread. "What did someone give you that changed you forever?" The answer was short. "A moment. And the belief that I could matter." Keanu read it twice. He didn't need to know who wrote it, because now he knew how much just one moment could give. The idea started as a whisper between two people who didn't believe they were builders. Clara had been talking with Keanu on the phone, thanking him again for the flash drive video. The conversation had paused, quiet and reflective, before she said it. "I wish there was a place for kids like I was, a place with a piano, and someone to listen." Keanu had let the silence linger, then said, "Maybe we can build one." Boise didn't have much in the way of free community arts programs anymore. Most had folded when grant funding dried up. Clara knew that firsthand. She had looked into it before, but always stopped short. Money, time, space, all the usual obstacles. But this time felt different. Keanu arranged a visit to a shuttered rec center on the city's east side. It was a long, squat building with peeling paint and cracked basketball courts out back. The inside smelled of dust and floor polish. But the bones were still good. He walked through the space with Clara, taking quiet mental notes as she described what she envisioned. Small music rooms, kids who needed an outlet, a piano at the front of the largest room, just like the one she remembered. He nodded, listening more than speaking. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Keanu handled the paperwork and outreach. Clara worked with local volunteers. One of her elderly patients turned out to be the former music director of a local church and offered to help. A neighbor donated used sheet music. Someone else delivered a box of old music stands. And Keanu made one call to have the piano transported from the old school to the community center. The day it arrived, Clara stood by the double doors, arms crossed over her chest, watching the movers carefully lift the piano onto the stage at the front of the main room. She didn't cry this time, but she did smile. It wasn't just about memory anymore. It was about presence. By the end of the month, the Boise Community Center had a name: the Leland Room. It wasn't printed on the outside of the building, just on a wooden sign above the main music room's door. Clara carved the letters herself, burning the name into the grain with a small hand tool she'd borrowed from a neighbor. The words weren't perfect. Some letters were uneven, but they were honest, like Mr. Leland had been. The space took shape slowly, piece by piece. Folding chairs came from a local church. A nearby high school donated old practice keyboards. Parents from the neighborhood stopped by to drop off extra guitar strings, broken tambourines, half-used composition books. None of it matched, but all of it mattered. Clara worked the front desk most days after her nursing shifts. Maya came with her, doing homework in the back office or helping arrange chairs for the younger kids. She loved handing out stickers to anyone who finished a practice session. On Thursdays, she would pull out her own beginner sheet music and sit quietly at the piano while Clara worked nearby. Every now and then, Clara would pause in the middle of organizing materials just to listen. Maya's notes were rough, uneven, but they were hers, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, a boy named David came in, 9 years old, shy. His mother spoke little English, and his eyes stayed locked on the floor. Clara greeted them gently, showed him around, and introduced him to one of the volunteers. When she turned to go back to the front, she heard it. 3 notes, then 4, then the start of a melody on the old piano. She turned and saw him there. No instruction, no permission, just instinct. He didn't stop playing until his mother called his name. Later, she found a piece of paper folded and left on the piano bench. He said, "I didn't know I needed this." He taped it to the inside of her office cabinet. The program didn't have a website yet, or a social media page. But word spread anyway. One person told another, a teacher told a parent told a neighbor. Slowly, kids began coming, not just to play, but to belong. They didn't need to be gifted. They just needed to be heard. And in the Leland room, they were. On a cool Saturday morning, Clara arrived early with Maya and unlocked the doors to the center. A small group of kids had signed up for a beginner workshop that day. She sat out sheet music, wiped down chairs, and lit a candle in the window. A quiet tradition she'd started. One small light to say the doors were open. Keanu showed up just before the session began, wearing his usual jacket, a box under one arm. He greeted Clara with a soft nod, then walked to the front of the room. She followed. Inside the box was a plaque. Carved from reclaimed wood and trimmed in brushed brass, it was simple but striking. He handed it to her gently, and she read the inscription slowly, her fingers running along the engraved words. To the ones who played, even when no one was listening. Clara said nothing at first, just held it. Then she looked up, eyes misted. "It's perfect," she said. They mounted it together on the front of the piano, just above the keys, where every child would see it each time they sat down. When the children arrived that morning, none of them asked about the new plaque. But one girl traced the letters quietly before starting her scales. Another boy paused halfway through his practice, staring at the words before continuing. That was enough. The music that day wasn't flawless. It wasn't supposed to be. But the room was full of something better. Honesty, effort, wonder. When Clara sat down to play at the end of the day, the room had mostly emptied. Maya sat on the floor coloring. Keanu leaned against the wall, arms folded. Clara played Still Here. The song drifted across the space, gentle and slow. The final notes lingered, like breath in cold air. And when the last chord faded, she looked up at the plaque. Then she smiled. The room wasn't just for music anymore. It was for memory. It was for beginnings. And it was here to stay. The message came late one afternoon, just after Clara had locked up the Leland room and was preparing to head home with Maya. Her phone buzzed as she slid it into her purse. She checked the screen. The name she hadn't seen in decades appeared. Jerome, janitor, Willow Creek School. She stared at it for a moment before answering. "Hello?" A familiar gravelly voice came through the line. "Clara May?" She stepped out into the parking lot, pressing the phone tighter to her ear. "Yes, is this Jerome from the old school?" Her chest tightened. "I remember. Of course I remember. I've been hearing about what you're doing." "Word travels, even if I move slow," he said with a chuckle. "Community center, piano room. That's something special." Clara smiled. "It's because of Mr. Leland. He gave me everything." There was a pause on the line. "I've got something for you," Jerome said quietly. "Something I've held on to a long time. I wasn't sure who'd ever want it. But it's his voice. I thought you should have it." Clara didn't speak. "I'll send it to your email," he continued. "It's just a voicemail, years old. He left it one night when he was rehearsing a speech, thought he was calling himself to hear how it sounded out loud. He never gave that speech. But I kept the message." Clara nodded slowly, voice catching in her throat. "Thank you, Jerome." "You take care of those kids, Clara." "I will." The call ended. Back at home, Clara opened the email with trembling hands. The audio file sat there with a plain title, Howard_Leland_recording up 3. She clicked play. There was a crackle of static, then the sound of a chair scraping across a wooden floor. Then, finally, a voice. Okay. Let's try this again." She froze. It was him. The voice continued, halting at first. "I don't know if this will ever be heard, but I need to say it out loud." Clara pressed her hand over her heart. Mr. Leland cleared his throat softly on the recording, then began again. They say music programs don't matter, that kids need math, science, jobs, that music is an extra, something to cut when budgets get tight. There was a long pause. I don't disagree with the need for food or numbers or roofs over heads, but what do we put under those roofs if we forget how to feel? Another pause. Clara could hear him shifting in his chair. I've seen students come through my door with more silence than sound inside them, kids who've never been listened to, kids who think feeling something makes them weak. And I've seen what happens when you put a piano in front of them and say, "Go ahead, tell me something." His voice trembled slightly. They don't always get it right. They don't always finish, but they try. And in trying, they tell the truth. And that's more than most adults do. Clara sat frozen at her kitchen table. Maya was playing in the next room, humming some half-learned melody, unaware of the moment unfolding just feet away. The voice grew softer, and in doing so, I don't know if anyone's listening. But I see my students. I hear them. Then his voice cracked, and that's what matters. The recording ended with the soft sound of him placing something on a desk. Then a faint hum, almost a tune, and the faint click of the phone disconnecting. Clara stared at the screen. She hit play again and listened all the way through. This time, the tears came quickly. They streamed down her face, quiet and unrestrained. She didn't try to stop them. His voice hadn't changed. Not in her memory, not in this recording, but still full of gentleness, full of belief, full of that rare kind of care that makes you feel for the first time like you are not just a body in a seat, but a person meant to be known. She wiped her cheeks and whispered, "I hear you too." And this time, she wasn't a little girl hoping someone would remember her. She was a woman holding proof that someone had. That night, Clara printed the voicemail transcript word for word, every pause, every stumble, every broken sentence. She didn't want to lose any of it. She placed the paper beside her journal, alongside Maya's drawing and the original Still Here sheet music. Then she lit a small candle on the windowsill and played the voicemail one last time. Not through headphones, through a small speaker, letting Mr. Leland's voice fill the room. It didn't feel like a ghost. It felt like home. The next day, at the community center, she brought the printout with her. During a break between classes, she gathered the older students into the Leland room and sat them down in a half circle of folding chairs. "I want to share something with you," she said. "It's a message from a man who believed in music even when no one else did." She played the voicemail for them, her eyes scanning their faces as they listened. Some looked puzzled at first, some fidgeted, but by the time Mr. Leland's voice cracked, every head was still. A few students looked down at the floor. One of them, Daniel, a quiet teen who barely spoke during lessons, rubbed his eyes and turned away. After the recording ended, no one said anything for a while. Then one girl, maybe 12, raised her hand slowly. "He's right," she said. "Sometimes this is the only place I can breathe." Clara nodded, unable to speak. Later that evening, after the students had gone home, she placed a small frame beside the piano. Inside was the full quote, typed neatly and centered. "They say music programs don't matter, but I see my students, I hear them, and that's what matters." She stepped back, arms crossed, and let the stillness of the room hold the moment. Mr. Leland had never delivered that speech in public. But now, in this space, his voice would be heard every single day. Clara stood in front of the piano with the two photographs in hand. The music room was empty, just after closing time. The last of the students had gone home, and Maya was curled up on a couch in the back office with a book. The first photo she held was weathered from time, edges curling just slightly at the corners. It was the one Mr. Leland's letter had been tucked beside. The original black and white snapshot of her, age 9, seated at the piano in the old school. Mr. Leland stood behind her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder, the other pointing to a spot on the music sheet in front of them. Her young face looked somewhere between focused and shy. His face was soft, encouraging. The moment had been frozen in time. The second photo had been taken just 2 weeks ago. Maya had asked to use the timer function on Clara's phone. They had been practicing together one afternoon, Maya stumbling through the first lines of the Echo song while Clara coached her gently. The timer had beeped just as Maya let out a giggle, her fingers slipping on the keys, and Clara turned to laugh along with her. That's when the photo clicked. Mother and daughter. At the same piano, same bench, same light pouring in through the high windows. It wasn't planned, but it was perfect. Clara brought both photos to the local print shop and had them restored and enlarged. She found matching blackwood frames. Simple, elegant, like Mr. Leland's classroom had always been. Now, with a soft cloth in one hand and a level in the other, she worked quietly to mount them side by side on the wall above the piano. She hung the old one on the left and hers on the right. 2 generations, 1 legacy. Once both photos were in place, Clara stepped back to look at them. She didn't try to hold in the emotion that swelled in her chest. The space between the frames seemed to hum with something invisible, a silent thread connecting the past and the present. A little girl who was once almost forgotten, and a woman who had remembered enough to return. She sat at the piano and played a quiet version of Still Here, letting the melody stretch and slow, as if it too were pausing to look up at the wall. Maya came out from the back and padded across the room in socks. She climbed into her usual spot beside her mother and rested her head on Clara's shoulder as the final notes faded. "Is that you in the picture?" Maya asked, pointing at the left photo. Clara nodded. "A long time ago. Is that the man who gave you the letter?" "Yes. His name was Mr. Leland." Maya studied the picture. "He looks nice." "It was more than nice," Clara said softly. "He saw people, even when no one else did." Maya turned to the second photo. "And that one's us." Clara smiled. "It is." She watched her daughter gaze up at the 2 frames, then reach out and touch the bottom edge of the right one. "I think he'd be proud," Maya said. Clara kissed the top of her head. "I think so too." They sat in silence for a while after that, letting the weight of everything settle gently. Not like a burden, but like a blanket. Later that evening, after Maya was in bed and the building had grown quiet again, Clara dimmed the lights and locked up. She stood in the doorway of the Leland room one last time and looked at the wall. The piano beneath the photos seemed to glow in the soft light, as though it had found its place again. She closed the door gently, not with finality, but reverence. Later that week, just after dusk, Keanu returned to the community center. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. The parking lot was empty, the building already dark, except for one security light glowing near the side door. He let himself in with the spare key Clara had quietly left for him under a painted rock beside the flower bed. Inside, the Leland room was still. He walked in slowly, footsteps soft against the linoleum. The air smelled faintly of chalk dust and something warm, like polished wood and distant music. He made his way to the piano and looked up. The 2 photos greeted him in the soft light from the hallway. He studied the first, Clara as a child, Mr. Leland beside her, his expression full of quiet pride. Then the second, Clara now, laughing beside her daughter, both of them seated at the very same keys. He stood there for a long time. Then, from the inside pocket of his coat, he pulled out a single red rose. It wasn't in a vase, no ribbon, just a fresh bloom wrapped gently in one of the pages torn from his notebook. On it, he had written a single line in pencil, "For the ones who stayed." He placed the rose just beneath the piano bench, angled carefully so it wouldn't be missed. Then he turned and left. No note, no noise, just the scent of the rose filling the air behind him as he stepped into the night. The door clicked shut. Inside the Leland room, the 2 photos watched over the silent piano, and beneath them, the rose waited. a quiet tribute to what had been lost and to what had been found again. The chairs were already filling by the time Clara peeked out from behind the hallway curtain. Rows of folding seats stretched across the Leland room, nearly every one taken. Parents, neighbors, teachers, even a few social workers. Children lined the edges of the stage area, some holding sheet music, others clutching recorders or violin bows, faces flushed with nerves and excitement. Clara smoothed her blouse and took a breath. Maya tugged at her hand. "You ready?" Clara smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "I think so." A volunteer handed her the wireless mic, then whispered, "Whenever you're ready." She walked to the center of the small platform and stood behind the upright piano, its surface freshly polished, the rose from earlier in the week still tucked in a small glass at the corner of the bench. The room quieted. Clara looked around at the sea of waiting faces, her eyes pausing on a group of foster children sitting near the front, most of them accompanied by caseworkers, a few with tentative new guardians. They reminded her of herself at that age, perched on the edge of things, unsure of whether they truly belonged. She raised the microphone to her lips. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "This is more than a recital, it's a beginning." She paused, letting her gaze settle on the piano behind her. "When I was 9 years old, I sat at a piano just like this one, in a room not so different from this. I was a foster kid. I didn't have a lot, but I had a teacher." She took a breath. "His name was Mr. Leland, and he didn't just teach me music. He taught me something much more important." She looked out again, her voice steady. Pearl said, "Heck taught me how to feel again." There was silence in the room, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, only understanding. Clara turned, walked to the bench, and sat down. She placed her fingers gently on the keys and without introduction began to play. The opening notes of "Still Here" echoed softly through the Leland room. Clara played slowly, each chord unfolding like a breath. The melody was familiar to some in the audience. Students who had heard it in passing, volunteers who had stayed late while she practiced. But now, in this setting, it took on a new kind of weight. It wasn't a performance. It was a gift. Clara's fingers moved with quiet certainty. Not perfect, not polished, but full of presence. Each note landed where it needed to. She had played this piece dozens of times by now, but this was the first time it had ever truly felt complete. The audience sat motionless. One of the foster kids in the front row, a boy no older than 10, leaned forward on the edge of his seat. His fingers tapped along softly on his knee, mimicking her movements. A woman in the back row closed her eyes and clasped her hands, holding them against her chest. A teacher from the local middle school wiped her cheek, quickly and without drawing attention. The melody circled back on itself in the middle, a soft echo of the opening, gentle, like memory. Maya sat just off stage, her stuffed rabbit resting in her lap, lips moving silently as she followed the shape of the song. When Clara reached the final measures, she let the chords stretch, the rhythm slow. The last line was played with her eyes closed, a long, suspended chord. Then silence. She opened her eyes and removed her hands from the keys. No one clapped right away. They just sat there, some with tears, some with soft smiles, some with their eyes still closed, as if afraid to break the moment. Then, from the middle of the room, someone began to applaud, gently, reverently. Others joined. The sound never grew loud. It remained careful. Like the people clapping were saying, "Thank you," more than they were saying, "Well done." Clara stood and bowed her head. The applause slowly faded, and when it did, the Leland room felt like it was holding its breath. Clara stepped away from the piano and stood quietly at the edge of the stage. Her heart was still beating fast, but it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something that felt like peace. The room remained hushed until a small voice broke the silence. It was Maya. She walked up to the stage, holding a folded piece of paper. She looked up at her mother, then turned to the crowd. "My mom wrote this song," she said. "She called it Still Here because sometimes people leave, but what they give you stays." A soft murmur ran through the crowd. Clara knelt beside her daughter, arms wrapping gently around her shoulders. Maya continued, her voice clear and careful. "Mr. Leland helped her find her music, and now she helps me find mine." There were no loud cheers, just a long, tender silence filled with understanding. One of the foster kids raised his hand. "Can we learn that song?" Clara looked out at him, eyes shimmering. "Yes," she said. "You can. All of you can." The boy nodded solemnly, as if taking her words as a promise. Clara stood and looked around the room. At the children, the parents, the neighbors who had come with curiosity and left with something deeper. "Music," she said softly, "isn't about being the best. It's about being heard, and about hearing others." She glanced up at the 2 photos hanging above the piano, then back at the room. "I'm here because someone stayed when they didn't have to. Someone taught me more than music. He taught me how to feel, how to begin again. And now it's our turn. To stay, to teach, to listen." The lights above glowed a little warmer. The bench sat empty again, but not for long. Tomorrow, another child would sit there. Another melody would begin, and someone would be listening. Sometimes, music never dies. It waits, in silence, in memory, in the hands of those we almost forgot. A broken key, a faded photograph, a bench left behind in a dusty schoolroom. These aren't just relics. They're waiting places. Places where someone, somewhere, once believed something beautiful could be born. Mr. Leland never got to finish his final speech. But what he gave lived on. Through Clara, through Maya, through every child who walked into the Leland room unsure if they belonged, and left humming a song they didn't know they had inside them. And what was passed from teacher to child didn't come wrapped in applause. It didn't make headlines or win awards. It arrived quietly, like all lasting things do, through listening, through staying, through one more lesson. Maybe the world didn't notice when Mr. Leland stayed behind after hours. Maybe no one wrote his name in big lights or printed his story in the newspaper. But he gave something no budget could replace. He gave belief. He gave time. He gave music to children who'd been told to stay quiet. And now, those children are teaching others. A note passed down, touch passed down, a memory that keeps playing. Maybe that's the most powerful thing we can do. Not build statues, not chase recognition, but place a piano in the corner of a room where someone might sit down one day and think, maybe I matter too. Maybe the ones who shape us most are the ones who never asked to be remembered. A teacher in a quiet town, a janitor who kept the lights on, a stranger who left behind more than just an echo. And maybe we carry their music forward, not by repeating what they said, but by living what they believed. Clara now teaches children the same way Mr. Leland once taught her, not with pressure, not with perfection, but with presence. One girl stayed after class last week, just to help wipe down the keys. Another came in early, not to play, but to sit quietly in the room and feel what it felt like to be surrounded by music before the world had a chance to interrupt. And Maya, she's started writing her own melodies. Clara listens to them every night before bed, because now the music lives in both directions, up the generations and forward. So, let us ask you something. Who taught you something that changed you forever, even if the world didn't notice? Who gave you their time, their wisdom, their music? Tell us in the comments. Share their name, share their story. Maybe your memory is the thing that keeps their song alive. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening, for remembering, for staying, because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones we need most. And now, here's what's coming next. A diner, air with a notebook, and a stranger's handwritten message that leads to the reunion of two sisters separated since birth. You won't want to miss it.